Hey there, and welcome to another video. In this video, we're going to look at the latest offering of Maya from Autodesk, Maya Creative. Just recently announced, I think it's fair to say there's been a lot of comments online from users about this, some good, some not so good. And now that I've had a chance to look at it myself, I thought I'd do a video and try my best to explain things and what this announcement means for users. I'll go through the basics of the product, what it is and what it does compared to the normal Maya, how much it costs, and importantly, is it something you should even be looking at? With this new offering, users now have 4 editions of Maya that they can choose from. And you might be asking yourself, why do we even need 4 different editions of Maya? Well, I can't speak for Autodesk personally, but from what I can see, they appear to be trying to provide different versions of Maya with different price points and slightly different feature sets, instead of having a one-size-fits-all. And in theory, this allows users to choose a version that best suits their requirements and circumstances, and importantly, is potentially affordable. So what are the Maya editions currently available? Well, it breaks down like this. And if we go to the main Autodesk website and look at the list of products, you can see them here. First is, I guess, the main Maya version, which is the most complete and full version of the software, and it's also the most expensive. Then we have Maya LT here. This was first launched in 2013 and is a very cut down feature version of Maya that was originally aimed at the hobbyist and indie game market. Next is Maya Indie, although you won't find Maya Indie here on the main list of products on Autodesk's main website. Instead, there's a separate landing page where all the details are listed, and you can also buy Maya Indie. Now, this is a full version of Maya, but at a greatly reduced price. That's because there's some restrictions on who can use it and how it can be used. Now, this was aimed at single users, freelancers, hobbyists, and also graduates who no longer had access to their free educational versions, but they still needed to keep on using Maya. And then finally, we now have the new Maya Creative, which is another reduced feature version of Maya, similar to Maya LT, but is only purchasable as a pay-as-you-go usage model using Autodesk's Flex tokens. And I'll be discussing Flex tokens later on in the video. So that's the 4 editions currently available. However, there's a slight curveball to this as well. With the announcement of Maya Creative, Autodesk also announced that they would be discontinuing the sale of new and renewals of Maya LT. So what this means to me is that Maya LT is going to be discontinued, and it looks like that Maya Creative is its replacement. And when we get to the end of this year, Maya, Maya Indie and Maya Creative will be the only Maya editions available to buy and use. Now, if Maya Creative is a replacement for Maya LT, does it have the same restrictions that Maya LT has? Because Maya LT was very, very limited. Let's take a closer look. Maya Creative is a cut down version of Maya that, according to Autodesk, and I quote, intended to lower the barrier to entry for artists at smaller facilities. And looking at the main product page, it's clear that the features that are missing appear to be the simulation and dynamics, which includes things like hair, cloth, fur, and also Bifrost. But aside from these, Maya Creative has all of Maya's modeling, rigging, animation, motion graphics, and rendering features. And that also includes Python scripting as well. And that's a lot more than what Maya LT had. Now, at this point, many users would be very much okay with this feature set because they have no need for dynamics, but everything else is just fine. And if anybody can remember Maya in its early days, there was an edition of Maya available with a very similar reduced feature set called Maya Complete. There was also another version called Maya Unlimited, which had everything included. There was also a version of Maya called Builder that was aimed at games designers, and Maya Live that was for motion tracking specifically. So at a glance, it looks like Maya Creative is a modern day Maya Complete. It's the full Maya package minus dynamics, and it also has a slightly lower price point. And that, I'm sure, would be a good deal for many. However, there's a slight sucker punch. Unlike Maya Complete at the time, Maya Creative can't load third-party plugins, and it has no SDK support for authoring plugins. Plus, there's only Windows and Mac support, no Linux. Now, on the main Maya Creative product page, there's a short comparison, but then if you expand out the option, there's a full feature-to-feature comparison between Maya Creative and the full Maya. And you can go down the list and quickly see which features are in which package. So you can see here from the main modeling side, it's got everything except paint effects. We go down to UV and texturing, it's got everything except Adobe Substance integration, because that would be a third-party plugin. Animation and rigging appears to be pretty much all complete. It's the same features in each one. Same for motion graphics as well. And rendering and imaging is pretty much the same, except for two things at the bottom here, Maya Toon Shader and Vector Renderer. But you could do these in Arnold anyway, so they're not really a big deal breaker. In terms of dynamics, what's interesting is it says that you can read Bifrost effects here directly into the package, but you can't author. So anything to do with Bifrost, including fluids and the ocean simulation system, is not there. XGen, fluid, fur, hair, all that's not included in Creative. In terms of pipeline integration, there's full Mel scripting, full Python scripting, PySide, and also probably Qt support for customizing the UI. But as you can see, there's no ability to create any plugins or load third-party plugins and tools. In terms of data and scene management, including file support, then Maya Creative does a very good job, and it's essentially the same as the full Maya. You've even got USD for Maya, which is really handy. So full referencing, Alembic, you can read and write Maya ASCII and Maya binary files. You can even import Maya LT files if you've maybe used that edition in the past and you wish to salvage some work. And you've also still got the game exporter and the send to functionality as well, which is essentially FBX exporting. Unfortunately though, because it's a plugin, you can't have the Unreal Live Link for Maya support, which is a funny one because it is actually an Autodesk plugin. So that would be first party, not third party, unless of course it contains a third party component. So that's a bit disappointing, but it'd be really good if the Unreal Live Link for Maya eventually does come into Maya Creative. Now, the lack of third party plugins will no doubt be a deal breaker for many, since many people use plugins, either paid for ones or free off the internet or open sourced. So does this mean that Maya Creative is a dud before it's got going, before we've even looked at the pricing? For some, I'm in no doubt that it is. The missing features alone are enough for it to be a non-starter for them. However, this won't be the same for everyone, and you can work in Maya without plugins, despite what many people may believe. And some tools that you think are plugins aren't actually compiled plugins, they're actually just scripts. And if they're Python scripts, then they should load into Maya Creative no problem. Now, since the announcement, there's been some negative comments about Maya Creative from the user base, and I think some of these are fully justified. However, the thing to bear in mind about this is while many users have expressed these views, it's very likely that Maya Creative probably isn't aimed at them. They're not the target audience or user. So who is? Well, let's actually boot up and look at Maya Creative and see what it can actually do. And is it that different from the full version of Maya? Now, to get Maya Creative, it's really very simple. It's just a downloadable trial like with any other Autodesk product. So from the main product page for Creative, select this option here, download free trial. It will take you through to another landing page where you need to enter some details and also log in with your Autodesk ID. But once you do that, it downloads the big installer and you should be able to run it just like you would do the full version of Maya. Now, to boot up Maya Creative, it's exactly the same as the full version of Maya. Use your desktop icon or from the start menu in Windows. It's entirely down to you. What will happen is you'll be presented with this splash screen, but Maya Creative will still be loading in the background. But what this splash screen just does is it gives you some basic information. It will tell you how many days you have left on your trial, which will be 30 days from the first install, because all of Autodesk's products are 30-day trials. I've got 18 days left because I've already been playing around with it. If you're ready to purchase or use Maya Creative, then you can do so here. This will direct you through to another site, more the online cart, and you can sort of buy the number of tokens you need, and then you can start using Maya Creative. Likewise, there's an option here that if you already have a license, it will take you through to another page, sign in with your Autodesk ID. and then you can think about assigning your tokens to your Maya Creative install. But when you're ready, you can just close this, no problem, and then you'll find that Maya Creative would have already booted up for you. Now, when you boot up Maya Creative, it's really exactly the same as the full version of Maya. There literally is no difference. So as we can see here, it's booted straight into the home screen, which is the default setting. You can turn this off if you don't want to see it every time you start up, so that's not a problem. But everything else here is exactly the same, including the getting started tabs and also the learning that takes you through to the various training resources that are available. The what's new section, though, is specific to Maya Creative. So all these sections here link to documentation about the particular Maya Creative feature or how something might work in Maya Creative that might be just a little bit different to the full version of Maya. But apart from that, it works in exactly the same way as the full version of Maya and its home screen. Now, once we enter the main package itself and get past the home screen, again, at a glance, if you look at this, it's no different to the full version of Maya. All the main modeling features and animation features, rigging and rendering are all there. You can flip between the modules very easily. I actually went through and compared these menus like for like with the full version of Maya, and there is literally no difference. They're both exactly the same. Now, if we look at some of the basics around file importing and exporting, because that's what you're probably going to really want to know about, because this is how you get data in and out of Maya Creative. Again, looking at the file menu, you go to open a scene and look at the dialog. All the main formats are there. It's exactly the same as normal Maya. ASCII binary, the MyLT format as well. If you scroll down the list, you've even got the CAD formats in there to do with JT, IGIS, step files. And if you move further down, you'll get the more familiar file types you might recognize. So we've got USD import, FBX, Alembic files, and also Arnold.ass. And these are also the same menu options that you get in the export all and export selection options as well. We can see we've got the send to features to Max, Motion Builder, Unity and Unreal, and they're essentially just FBX exports really. The game exporter tool is also there as well. That works in exactly the same way, no problem. We can also do references, again, full feature reference editor, and the ability to create references is also available. In terms of the big things like Arnold for rendering, again, it's fully featured. There literally is no difference. What I've done now is I've loaded up a scene that I've used in some of my other videos, and you might recognize this scene if you've watched any of those videos. This is a Bugatti model. It's one of the Arnold demo data sets that you can download. Now, I did this Maya scene in Maya 2022. It's loaded into Maya Creative, absolutely no problem. If we go to the Hypershade, we can see that all the shaders have also come across as well. That's all perfectly fine. And again, I've got the Arnold lights in there as well that were previously in that scene. And from this point, I should be able to just go to the renderer, choose Arnold, and there we go. It's rendering no problem. If I just disable this, I could even go to the Arnold render view, do the same thing there as well, and I get a render. I can even go to the panel here and choose an imager if I want to. All the features are there that I would have used in the normal version of Maya. So that's absolutely fantastic. Now, jumping ahead ever so slightly to test more of the Arnold rendering features. This is an Arnold stand-in. So all I did, I went to the Arnold menu, added a stand-in, and I pointed it to a file. Now, this is actually a USD file. So again, in the full version of Maya, I had this Bugatti model already set up with all the shaders. I exported that using the Arnold scene export function, and I exported it as a USD. And I'm now using that USD file as my stand-in in Maya Creative. So this is loaded in, no problem. All I need to do now is add a simple dome light and switch my renderer to Arnold, and we're now rendering our Arnold stand-in, and it's a USD file as well. And again, everything works in exactly the same way. I can start zooming in here and it will refresh, and I can now start going into the stand-in properties itself and then start making some adjustments, because we can see here we've got some slight subdivision issues which can often occur when you export into USD. Now, there's another cool thing as well, which is in Maya Creative, and is also in the latest edition of Maya as well, the 0.2 release for Maya 2023, which you might not have yet if you've not downloaded it. And that's here in this panel for the viewport, right in the upper left corner. There's now the ability to start and stop Arnold in the viewport, but there's now also a render region, so you can define a kind of crop window and it will only render within that window. And this is really cool. So if I just start that going, get my marquee, just drag a box over somewhere, it will only render inside that box. And of course I can rotate the camera like so, and with my machine and card, I'm getting a pretty good playback as well. This box is also changeable, so I can scale it and reshape it to whatever I need. So this is really good if you just want to highlight a particular area, for example, or zoom in without having to waste time rendering the entire frame. This is a really cool feature. This is one of my favorite features from Softimage, because we had this ability for years, but it never really came into Maya as a core feature. There were some plugins some time ago which worked with Mental Ray, but it was never native inside Maya until now. So this is a really cool addition. Just going back to my stand-in now. So what I'm going to do is, just to show that things work, I can expand out the hierarchy of my stand-in, and now I can start basically choosing parts of the bodywork, and now I can start changing certain things and saying, right, now I can add an assignment, choose the subdivision type. There we go. So we've got that corner, that edge there working fine, and I can go through the rest of the model if I want to and fix those issues just as I would in the normal version of Maya. So that all works great. So again, there's literally no difference here to rendering in Maya Creative to rendering in the full version of Maya. And I think this is a pretty good use case scenario. If you've got full lighting abilities and full rendering abilities and features in Maya Creative, then it's certainly possible for someone to do look dev work or maybe some lighting work in Maya Creative, and you can export any of that setup and configurations over to the full version of Maya if you need to do that. Now, as I used a USD file for that Arnold stand-in, I thought I'd just quickly show you the USD integration in Maya Creative as well, because I think this is really important for Maya Creative going forwards, because USD is certainly a format and framework which is getting a lot more adoption now in people's workflows and pipelines. So I've loaded the Pixar kitchen set USD example into Maya Creative, no problem. What I did here, I went to the create menu and I just loaded a USD file as a stage. We can see it here in our outliner. If we display shapes, we can extend out the hierarchy, and we can see that the icons match those that you see in the full version of Maya. So what we've got here is actually native USD data. It's not been converted to Maya data, and that's exactly what we want, because that will contain the configurations and schema that USD uses. For example, most of this this scene has got variant sets. So if I choose this refrigerator here, frame it in the outline, and we can see that it's got a slight V next to the icon, which means it's a composition arc and it's a variant. And I can right click this, scroll down to variant sets, and there's two variants here. We've got bare or decorated. So again, you can see all this works in Maya Creative, no problem. So this is really cool. This means that Maya Creative can actually import USD data from the full version of Maya or another package that supports USD. You've also still got the USD layer editor as well. So again, you can start working on it in that way. The unfortunate downside is, just like in the full version of Maya, you can't do much setup in terms of creating variant sets and so on, like scopes and materials with USD yet. I'm sure that's going to be coming soon, but at the moment, the best way to do that is to do it in Bifrost USD in the full version of Maya. But that aside, you could still do some rendering and look dev work using USD files in Maya Creative. Now, I'm not going to go through all the modeling features in Maya Creative, but trust me, they're all there and it works in exactly the same way as the full version of Maya. The next thing to look at, and perhaps will be more pertinent to some people, will be the rigging and animation. And this is where things can be a little bit tricky. So for example, when it comes to the rigging, Maya Creative has got full-blown features of human IK. So we can create a skeleton, no problem, and we can assign human IK to it and the rig, and that all kind of works no problem. There's also the content browser as well. So there's various example rigs here that you can actually use. So the Maya bot that's used in the tutorials is there that you can use. Also, there's motion capture examples as well. So again, you can easily import these in and retarget it using human IK. So that works great. And I think that's a really good thing to have in Maya Creative, because again, from a use case scenario, there's nothing wrong with bringing in your own custom skeleton rig and then using human IK to do any kind of motion capture retargeting. So again, I think that's a good example of how you could use Maya Creative for that type of work. In terms of the animation editors and workflow, you've got all the full graph editor, time editor, the dope sheet, the ghosting editor is in there as well. You've got all the bookmarks and all those kind of really cool features that have been going into the recent versions of Maya. So that's all great. The problem you're going to have, though, is if you've built a rig in the full version of Maya and you want to have someone animate it in Maya Creative. Because if you've used any nodes in that rig that come from maybe a third-party plugin, or maybe have been using things like follicles or dynamics, then those nodes won't work in Maya Creative, and therefore your rig might not work in the way that you intended. Now, to give you an example of what I mean and the problem you're going to encounter with rigs, I've downloaded this rig from the internet and I've loaded it into the full version of Maya 2023.2. Now, this is a free rig that's available from the Academy Software Foundation. And what they've done is they've started to create a digital production example library. And this is going to be a library of assets that demonstrate the scale and complexity and various data examples of what's included in film production and visual effects and so on. And some people have already started to actually donate things to this already. So I'll include the link to this in the description below, but I really do recommend that you check it out. So if you just look at the examples here, you can download some video footage. Animal Logic have donated their A-Lab scene, which is for USD, which is awesome. And this is the character that I'm now referring to. Now, if we go into the details, this has come from an internal production team at AWS. And there's a full rig in there. It's all rigged up for geometry hair or Yeti hair. And there's also all the textures for low resolution and high resolution look dev work as well. So what I've done is I've taken this file and loaded it into Maya. So everything works. We can start to click a few manipulators and we've got a full-blown animation rig. So it's really cool. I definitely recommend you check this out. Now, what I've also done, I've loaded this into Maya Creative. And unfortunately, we've had a few errors and this is what we've basically got. So at first glance, everything seems to have come across no problem. But as you can see, the upper body here is greatly out of shape and we've got some issues with the mesh. Now, when I looked at the error messages that come through, it noticed there was a few nodes in here called follicle. And I think that's because this has been rigged up to work with Yeti, the third-party hair plugin. Now, I have actually had a small discussion with one of the people who's built this rig. And they said that the rig for this character was built with vanilla Maya, with no other plugins whatsoever, except for Yeti. And they used Yeti for the hair and the rendering. And that's the problem. Now, it works in the full version of Maya. And that's okay, because there's enough of the dynamics in there for Maya for it to actually work. But you just won't get the full dynamics because you're not using the Yeti plugin. But the rest of the rig will actually work. Probably because it's been built with Maya nodes. But because Maya Creative doesn't have any dynamics in it, so all that's been stripped away, then any of those nodes that are in the rig, they'll just be ignored, and then we've got these problems here. So that's going to be the issue you're going to encounter if you start trying to load any rigs into Maya Creative. But it's not always going to be the same. I mean, there's lots of really good free rigs out there for Maya, and some of them work perfectly well. Now, as an example of rigs that can work, this was something I downloaded from Animation Mentor, and there's details on the screen about this rig, and I'll also include links down below on where you can actually get this rig as well. Now, this loaded in no problem. There was some error messages, but I think it's more to do with mental ray nodes and not necessarily to do with the rig, because when I did some tests, everything seemed to work perfectly fine. There were absolutely no problems at all. I can flip between FK and IK on this rig and do whatever I want with it. So this all works great. It's a really fun rig to use. There's some really cool features in it, so I'd really encourage you to check these rigs out from Animation Mentor, because they're really, really good. And you'll probably find that for a lot of this stuff, it's really all you need. You don't need much more than this, but it's really going to depend on the type of animation that you're trying to actually produce. So I think when it comes to Maya Creative and rigging and animation as a whole, as I said, it's going to be down to what you're trying to do with it. If you've got a simple enough rig like this and you've got it already set up, then it's going to work just fine for you. Maya Creative has got all the animation feature set from Maya. It's going to be just fine. But if you've got a more complex rig that you've built in Maya Creative and you've used some third-party plugins for it, or you've used anything from the Dynamics module in there as well to maybe do hair or cloth or something, then when you load it into Maya Creative, it's not going to work. The main rig can work though. On the AWS character, the rig itself was actually fine. So you may want to dissect it a little bit more and just replace or fix some of those body issues, because all you're doing is creating skeletal animation. And if that's all you need, and you can get away with not worrying about the mesh fixes, then Maya Creative could actually work for you. But the danger is the data might not be consistent. So that's really going to be down to you to think about what's going to be the best approach. So we've looked at some of, I guess, the core features that users will be most interested in. The thing I just want to briefly touch upon now is pipeline integration. Now, you might have already noticed in my version of Maya Creative on my shelves, I've got a Bifrost shelf and an effects shelf and also an XGen shelf. Now, these modules aren't included in Maya Creative. So how come I've got them in my version that I've got installed? Well, this is because I'm running multiple versions of Maya on this workstation. So I already showed you a moment ago, I've currently got Maya Creative and the full version of Maya running both at the same time. Now, they both go into their own respective install directories, and they also have their own set of specific preferences. But on my setup on this machine, I've got the Maya app directory and the Maya environment directory set to one centralized location. So I use one Maya environment variable file for everything. And because of that, it's pulling in my shelves from one centralized resource, which is why I've got my own personal shelf here, and I've only got one thing installed on it. So it's possible for Maya Creative to run concurrently alongside a full version of Maya. That's really no problem. If you wanted to go further, remember there's full Python scripting and full Mel scripting in Maya Creative. And what that essentially means is you can load up the script editor and start coding with Mel or Python, really, depending on what your preference actually is. So if you've got, say, the user setup script that many people have used previously, you can configure it so that it will load a certain set of shelves or preferences from a specific location. But that's really entirely down to you. I'm just one person on my own. I don't have an elaborate studio setup. Now, in terms of the preferences themselves, the preferences are there just as normal as they are in the full version of Maya. You can change these and save them out, and they will be saved out to a specific Maya Creative directory, just in the same way that you'd have if you had another version of Maya. So there's no conflict with Maya Creative preferences and also the full version of Maya as well. Same with things like the plugins. The plugin manager is actually present in Maya Creative because many of the features in Maya now, although first party, are actually plugins. So things like Maya USD, Arnold, the sweep mesh tool, for example. And you can see there's a whole load of pipeline tools here and plugins that you can load. You've got the game pipeline, the game vertex count, for example. You've got human IK loaded, and you can choose to load and unload these really depending on what it is you want to use. You might have noticed at the top here, I've got Omniverse. Now, this is a third-party plugin, but again, I can't load it into Maya Creative, it won't allow me because Maya Creative won't load third-party plugins. The reason why this is here is because it's pulling from one centralized Maya environment file. So it'll be listed here, but I can't do anything with it. If I move down the list, you can see Bifrost is actually here as well, and the Bifrost graph is loaded. And this is because in the documentation, it says that Maya Creative can load Bifrost files. Or more specifically, it will load a Maya file that contains a Bifrost graph, and that should run correctly. But there is some caveats to that. In the documentation, it says that you can run Bifrost graphs in Maya for things like rigs and some effects, but you can't edit the graph or create anything new in the graph either. Now, if you open a scene that contains Bifrost graphs, you can make other changes to it, non-Bifrost changes, and that will play back and even save out no problem. The graphs will continue to work. But the problem is as well is if you're using it for simulations, so if you've got any Bifrost fluids, or you're using the Boss Ocean kit, then that's not going to work. You know, the scene will load, but you'll get an error message saying that it contains Bifrost fluids and it basically won't work. So those are just some things just to be aware of. Looking further down the list, we can see the Mash toolkit is there. There's the Hydra plugin that's part of the MyUSD plugin. There's the MyUSD plugin itself. There's FBX and also Maya to Arnold, and also the Sweep Mesh tool. You'll notice as well that I've got the Unreal Live Link for Maya plugin installed. That's in my full version of Maya, but it's listed here, but there's no entry to load because there's no support for that at the moment, which is a real shame. I really hope Autodesk address that, because Maya Creative and having the Live Link plugin to Unreal would be really, really cool. Now, in terms of loading things up like scripts, that should work no problem. There's full Mel scripting and full Python scripting. Now, I mentioned my shelf earlier on, so I've got a tool on here already installed, which is a file texture manager. Now, it's brought up an error here, but that's not a problem. It doesn't affect the functionality. It's more to do with the code and the actual framework for the UI, because this is quite an old plugin that I downloaded from highend3d.com, but it still does work because it's one of the best plugins around for being able to rename your textures. Now, regarding anything else, I did some tests, and one particular test I did was on Studio Library. So Studio Library is a free tool for having poses and animation in Maya. So it's free to download. It's really cool. It's a popular tool that many people use, but it's really just scripts. It's nothing else. It's not a compiled plugin. So I was able to download it, and then in the install directory, I've got it here. There's just some simple text instructions, and all you do is you take this install.mel and just drag it into the viewport. So if I do this in Maya Creative, the button will appear on the shelf, and then if I click this, I've got Studio Library working inside Maya Creative. So this is something you're going to have to test out yourself, because if you've got some tools or what appear to be plugins, but they're just scripts only, there's nothing compiled in there, then at face value, I can't see any reason why they won't work, unless there's some dependency in the code on something. So this is just purely scripting, so they all should work no problem. So again, it's going to be down to you and the tools that you use on whether or not you'll be able to use Maya Creative. I think if you've got very few plugins in your pipeline, or maybe you're a smaller outfit and you don't use that many, and you're just relying upon scripts, then I can't see any reason why Maya Creative won't be an option. But again, it's going to be entirely down to you. So in summary, Maya Creative does have the majority of Maya features that many users will need. All of the restrictions that Maya LT had have been removed. And for a good amount of features such as modeling, animation, rendering, Mash, Creative has full parity with the full version of Maya. There literally is no difference. Not being able to load third-party plugins is likely to be a big issue for many people though. But Maya's plugin manager is in Maya Creative because many of Maya's features are actual plugins. So it remains to be seen if Autodesk would ever consider allowing Maya Creative to access anything from third parties. So if you wanted to use Maya Creative, is it as simple as buying a subscription like you would do for normal Maya? Well, no, it isn't. And this is where things get interesting and perhaps confusing. Currently, to use Maya, you need a subscription. And depending on what flavor you want, that can be monthly, annually, or every 3 years. Maya Indie can also be bought with a subscription, but that's only available on annual only. Now, subscriptions are bought against a specific product. You can't mix and match them. And you can use the product as little or as often as you want during the term of that subscription. And Maya Creative is different. Instead of subscriptions, it uses Autodesk Flex tokens. These were announced earlier this year, and Autodesk Flex tokens essentially offered a new way of using their software. And the thinking behind it is this. Let's say, for example, you needed another license of an Autodesk product, but you only needed it for a short period of time, say a few days at a time. Now, you could buy a monthly subscription, but if the usage was going to be substantially more than that, then your only option was to go annual, and that could be too much for what you need and also too expensive. Likewise, if you wanted to use a product for just a few days at a time over a longer period, buying a subscription could work, but if you had to keep on buying it 1 month at a time, then that could end up being too expensive and it's less value for money. So the idea of Flex was that you buy tokens that allows you to use a product for a single day at a time. That's a full 24 hours. And you can use it on an occasional basis as well. So it's a lot like a pay-as-you-go model. Now, to use some products, you need more than one token for a full 24 hours. For example, AutoCAD, you need 7 tokens in order to use that product for a full single day. For the full version of Maya, you require 6 tokens for a full day's usage, and that's the same as 3ds Max. Maya Creative, on the other hand, you only need 1 token to use that product for a full single day. Now, of course, you might not know precisely how many days you're going to need. So rather than trying to work it out or buy tokens one day at a time, Autodesk decided to sell tokens in packs. And the minimum pack you can buy is 100 tokens. And you can see here from the pricing, that will cost you $300. Now that will be different to your localized currency. Now, when you buy your pack of tokens, you can then assign them to as many users as you think you need, and then they can access whatever product is available. Now, as I just mentioned, when it comes to Maya Creative, that will cost you 1 token a day. Remember, a day is a full 24 hours. So if you bought the minimum pack of tokens here, that would give you 100 days of usage. And these tokens, or these 100 tokens, can be used anytime throughout the year from the date of purchase. But you need to be careful because after 1 year, if you haven't used up your tokens, they actually expire. So what you have to do is try and work out or estimate maybe how many users you might need for tokens and maybe how many days a month. And that's always very hard to do. And it all comes down to crunching the numbers and looking at how much Flex might cost you at certain times a year, depending on your circumstances. Now, Autodesk provide a calculator that allows you to select a product, the number of users, and then how many days you think you might need per month to use that particular product. So I've got Maya Creative already loaded into the tool here at 1 user and 1 day a month. And of course, it's telling me that it's going to be 100 tokens for the year because that's the minimum amount that I can actually buy. Now, I can increase the number of days per month, but it will still stay at 100 tokens because, again, it's the minimum pack that I can buy. And what this does, this equates to essentially $3 a day, $3 a day to use Maya Creative. And of course, that will be different depending on your local currency. Now, if I increase the days per month and I hit 8 days, I suddenly get a warning here because I've gone 1 more than a 7-day week. And it tells me that based on this data, a subscription might be considered instead. Now, some people take this at face value and just go, well, this is pointless because if I go more than 8 days a month, then it's telling me to buy a subscription. It's not actually telling you to buy a subscription, and it doesn't tell you categorically that the subscription is the best option. It's just said to consider buying it. What you've really got to do is go a bit further into the numbers and compare them exactly to the other offerings that are available. I'm going to increase my number of days now to 20. So I'm going to go on the premise of a month of there's 4 weeks in a month and there's 5 working days each week. So that's 5 multiplied by 4 gives us 20 working days a month, and there's no weekends. Now, the calculator is telling me that I need 240 tokens to use Maya Creative for a full year. That's if I used it 20 days a month, every month of the year. And that comes to $720. Now, you might be thinking that's expensive, but if you go and look at Maya, Maya will cost you $1,785 a month. Now, that's a lot more expensive. However, it is the full version of Maya. So there is a difference in the cost and also the features. Now, you might be thinking, I could buy Maya Indie instead because I can get that for a year and that's meant to be cheaper. And it is. If you want a version of Maya Indie, that will only cost you $290 a year. So that's even cheaper. And it's also the full version of Maya. So you might be thinking, if I can buy Maya Indie at a cheaper cost for a year, and it's the full version of Maya, then why do I even need to bother with Creative? Just get Maya Indie. Well, the problem is, as a user or a company, you can only have one Maya Indie subscription. So you can't buy more than that. Also, there's a limit to your earnings that restricts the usage of Maya Indie. If you earn more than $100,000 or work on a project that's valued more than $100,000, you can't use Maya Indie. And remember, I'm just quoting US dollars. It will be different against your localized currency. So although Maya Indie has an attractive price, if you're a small studio or an individual, it's not an option if you need to purchase that just one extra seat of Maya. If you need more Maya usage, short or long term, then your options before now was to buy another Maya seat and pay monthly or annual subscription, or use flex tokens at 6 tokens for a full day's usage. But now there's another option with Maya Creative, and that only uses 1 token a day, and that equates to $3 a day. So if you look at it and compare the pricing and against the features that you need, then Maya Creative could work for you. You know, it is value for money if you only need those features. If you need more than that and you need the full Maya, then perhaps it's not the option for you. So when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, is Maya Creative worth it? Well, yes and no. It will very much depend on who you are, what you do, and how you manage your software and budgets. If you're a visual effects CGI studio with many users, 10 plus, 20 plus, maybe even more, and you often scale up and down with contractors and projects, you could also have a solid pipeline that uses a variety of plugins, then Maya Creative probably isn't for you. Although you scale up and down with users, that could justify some flex tokens, but it's probably better that you stay on normal subscriptions because you're using Maya literally all the time. And you can assign and unassigned subscription licenses as people come and go from your studio. But if you're a smaller studio, or maybe a team or department inside a bigger company, and perhaps you do a different type of work, maybe video editing work, mainly in 2D in something like Nuke or After Effects, and you perhaps need some 3D work from time to time when a bigger project comes up and you only need it for maybe a few weeks or maybe a couple of months, then Maya Creative at its price point is an option to consider. You can bring in some freelancers or even use your own people, and you're only paying for the specific uses that you determine. The main thing though is you have to make sure that Maya Creative does actually provide you with all the features that you need. If it does, then I think it's definitely worth looking at. It's the same if you're a single user or maybe a freelancer or maybe even a very small studio. You may already have your own Maya licenses, full Maya or even Maya Indie. And as a single user, as long as you meet the criteria, Maya Indie is probably the best and cheapest option that gives you access to the full version of Maya. But if you just need another seat of Maya, say to do some rendering or maybe have another person help out on a project, and you're looking for something cheaper, then flex tokens and maybe Maya Creative could be an option for you. Remember, Maya Creative can do rendering. So if your scene or assets have no nodes from third-party plugins, or maybe you're using USD or Alembic caches, then Maya Creative should be able to load and render that data no problem. You could even utilize a virtual machine in the cloud and use Maya Creative in that context because you're only going to be using that for set periods at a time. So there's definitely justification for Maya Creative, but frankly, it's not going to be for everyone. And although people can frequently be critical of Autodesk, to be fair to them, they're not saying Maya Creative is for everyone. They're simply offering you another version of Maya that gives you some flexible options for using it. And that's either going to suit you or it's not. So it's going to be really down to you to test it out for yourself. Now, I hope I've been able to give you a pretty good overview of Maya Creative, what it can do and how it works, and more importantly, how you can get access to it. But if you've got any questions, then feel free to put them in the comments below and I'll try my best to answer them. In the meantime, any information or data that I've included in this video, I'll include it in the descriptions below, and also check out some more tutorials on my channel at the same time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.